when we started this series 3 weeks and a day ago. So I came here wearing a Yankee cap. As we know, the season prematurely ended. But I also want to discuss this cap that I'm wearing and this sweater that I'm wearing, because I want you all to admire this, because my mother made this almost 45 years ago.
It still fits.
It still fits. Not only that, I mean, look at this. You know? And I've actually worn it since. And also, this kippah, this yarmulke, was also knitted by my mother. She made 4 dozen of these when her grandson, my son Alex, was called up for the Torah. So I just thought I would honor my mother. I mean, it's the synagogue, you know, it's appropriate. Anyway, so thank you again for coming for this last evening. And in your roadmaps that some of you have retained, and there are more copies that are there, you notice that on the front page there were 3 quotes. And tonight we'll deal with the last quote, and in a sense I've set up the props for this, for the William Faulkner quote, that the past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. So here's where we've been and where we're going, so that is there. But as I said, I sort of wanted so much to get through to the last possible beginning that I kind of rushed through things toward the end. And I'm actually going to use a few of these names to describe the last period after the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans on June. And you had something like 3 million soldiers from Romania and Germany and other groups invade. And behind them were what were known as Einsatzkommando, tactical units whose responsibility was to fulfill the Commissar Decree, which is to summarily execute the political officers as well as potential partisans. And it's during this period, as they're moving on, that you could say that what is happening to the Jewish communities that were in the former Eastern Poland and Belarus and Ukraine was ethnic cleansing. You're sort of pushing them out. But over the course of that summer, with these Einsatzgruppen, you move to genocide. What happened during these months was they began killing all the Jewish men. Not the women, not the children. Why do I call that genocide?
I wanted to clarify what the difference was between genocide and ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing is you're removing a population. You don't necessarily have to kill them. In other words, when we talked about the territorial solution, it meant to remove the Jews from Germany, then remove the Jews. And so it's a matter of pushing them away. So that's ethnic cleansing. Genocide, and I call this an act of genocide because what it was killing the future of the Jewish people, because if there are no men, there will be no little Jewish children, so there would be no future. During the course of the fall, then, it moves to the final solution. The future is now. And it's at that point when they began killing women, children, elderly. And that was the shift. Okay. Now, the previous 2 weeks, we explored different ways we could talk about the beginning of the event and how how one considers to be the meaning, how they, these events are about, will lead them to posit a particular sort of beginning. Like, as I suggested, if you think the world's always hated the Jews, and this is just the culmination of the world's hatred, you would start at the 5th century before the Common Era. Or all sorts of varieties of ways of interpreting. If you think again, if it's Adolf Hitler, 1889, it's all about Hitler. But there are other ways also of looking at these as sort of steps along the way. Not necessarily any one particular cause, but once you reach a certain threshold, it makes it easier to cross the next threshold of discrimination or persecution or expulsion. But you don't have to go all the way at any one of these moments. Crossing these thresholds make it possible. And so we drew all of this. But there's a very important Jewish concept that I think we need to bear in mind when we look at these various dates. And that concept, it's not of this particular season, but the concept is dayenu. It would have been enough. In other words, these restrictions on Jewish participation in the civil service and law and medicine, that was bad enough. You don't have to worry, don't have to think, oh my God, it was from there to the Holocaust, to the final solution. Here's where we need to start talking, saying, that's enough. So each one of these moments, different forms of actions against Jews or against individuals, such as with euthanasia, with those individuals who were mentally ill or disabled, that's enough. And so when we look at this, you can look at it in terms of its relationship to the attempted destruction of European Jewry. But how you should also look at it, and perhaps more importantly, look at it when you see acts like this, forms of persecution, discrimination, you should be saying dayenu. That's enough. Okay? So, just as talking about beginnings are acts of interpretation, so are talking about endings. What does it mean for an event to end? So I have a number of dates over here. And I've begun with 1945, January 27th. Why that date? That is the date in which Auschwitz was officially liberated by the Soviet Army. And January 27th has become the date where International Holocaust Remembrance Day is honored. So, and we talked already about how Auschwitz became a way of thinking through the event. So can we think of this as a kind of ending? Because it's tied to liberation, it's tied to commemoration. Or, and I have two dates here, May 8th and May 9th, 1945. That was when the Third Reich ended. Why two dates? In the West, the war ended in Europe on May 8th, but in the Soviet Union, it was May 9th. And so when we were commemorating the end of World War II recently, it was at a different date than how it was being commemorated in Russia. But again, Third Reich is over, therefore the folks, even though there still was killing going on, there still was dying going on, but the war is over. Can we say that's when it ends? But does such an event end when the killing stops? And here I put 1946 to 1948. This is the period of the international military tribunals where various individuals in the party, in the government, industrialists, doctors were put on trial in Nuremberg and other places, as well as in places like Poland, Norway, France. There were what were called successor trials. In other words, crimes against the French, against the Polish. Individuals were put on trial there, not just local collaborators, but for instance, I believe Hess was the commandant at Auschwitz, was put on trial by the Polish and was executed by the Poles. So this is a period when the perpetrators, the criminals, okay, there's a crime, it's recognized. Now you have retributive justice. Justice has been served, individuals have been punished. Does that mean that the event has ended? We come to 1948. 1948 is up there for two particular events. One is the official recognition, the signing by a sufficient majority of countries for the protocol for the prevention and punishment of genocide. So here you have the beginnings of international law. In other words, transforming that event into something as a way, as part of the legal system to deal with potential future such events. Is that a way of saying now this event is beginning to be incorporated within our understanding of the world? And another event happened in 1948, which was the founding of the State of Israel. Does that mark an ending? Has there been some sort of cosmic balance achieved? You have destruction, and now you have restoration or redemption. Is there a balance here? Is the founding of the State of Israel sort of restoring a certain kind of equilibrium? Now, it should be noted that when the UN called for the founding of a State of Israel and of Palestine, the attempted destruction of European Jewry was not mentioned in any of the documents. Okay? But does it feel for Jews and their understanding a sort of, you cannot erase what had happened, but a certain kind of, balance is the wrong word, but that's all I can come up with, sorry. So is 48 a way of seeing a sort of, some form of, not resolution, but reconciliation? The 1950s. During the 1950s, the Federal Republic of Germany began giving reparations. 3 billion Deutschmarks to Israel, and sums for certain victims of Nazi persecution under a variety of conditions, varieties of interviews had to be done. But now you have the successor of the perpetrating state taking responsibility and attempting some form of restorative justice going on here. So in other words, is there a kind of, here are them recognizing what they have done? Not the international world recognizing, but the Germans seem to recognize and attempting to make some sort of amends. We're not judging, how good it was or their motives, but just to think about it, is this a way of saying an event is coming to a certain kind of end? And then we have 1960 to 61. Adolf Eichmann, who was the individual responsible for the resettlement of European Jewry, was captured in Argentina, brought to Israel, put on trial. In the international war tribunals, the victims did not testify. What was employed to demonstrate the guilt of the perpetrators was documentation, not testimony from victims. The Eichmann trial, yes.
Was it not allowed?
It was viewed as would not be effective in terms of getting the guilt, because you could always then have the defendants questioning their testimony, whereas documentation produced by the perpetrators, they can't argue against that. But here in Jerusalem, over 100 survivors testified. But there's another aspect of the Eichmann trial that made it so significant, not only in terms of now you're putting him on trial for crimes against the Jewish people, but it was a worldwide event. It was televised. I mean, at this point, 1960, 61, Israel was somewhere between a developing and an underdeveloped nation. It was not part of realpolitik. It was not a center of, as it would become, of the Cold War. It was there. Why this concern? That's why you have this sheet in front of you. Take a look at this. Is a full-page ad from in the New York Times, from WABC Channel 7 in New York, announcing that every night there will be televised film. There will be film of the day's events in the trial. In other words, it wasn't just an event in Israel. It wasn't just an event that would be reported the next day in newspapers. It was going to be in people's living rooms. Amazing. Why would this happen? Look at this full-page ad getting people to watch. Well, those of you who were watching television back in 1961 might recall that there were three networks. You had ABC, CBS, and NBC. And ABC was a very distant third. Also, the nightly news was 15 minutes. In New York, which at that point had the largest Jewish population in the world, and television being such it is, the most important market for advertisers and media, WABC New York decided to expand the news, and the last 15 minutes would be devoted to the Eichmann trial, so that at 7 p.m., all of those individuals watching would then be on Channel 7, and they'd be turned on to the beginning of the prime time television schedule. So the needs of the third network helped transform the Eichmann trial into a worldwide phenomenon. And so that the world, or at least significant portions of the United States, became aware in very gripping testimony of what European Jewry had experienced 16 years before. So now that the victims have a voice, now that the world has been exposed to this event as a worldwide event that happened to the Jewish people, not just to civilians, not just to Germans and Poles, does that provide a certain kind of closure to the event? In 1963 to 1965, you had the first major trials in Germany of perpetrators. These were the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. When the perpetrator state not only engages in some forms of restorative justice, but now is willing actually to punish, to engage in that sort of justice, does that mark a new awareness, a recognition, not just that there are victims, but literally in law they have committed crimes? So does that provide a different kind of closure? But it also created a very difficult kind of problem, because the rules of conviction was there had to be a direct act of murder that was witnessed. This was a bit of a problem with the Eichmann trial. Could one demonstrate that Eichmann personally held a gun to somebody and shot them? That was not an issue in Jerusalem. But in Frankfurt, this became the criterion. In other words, not an act against a people, but murder of an individual. But nevertheless, here is the perpetrator state recognizing that crimes were committed and should be punished by themselves. Okay, 1967. If you were around conscious Jewish in 1967 during the spring, you may not have had any desire to do Aliyah, move to Israel. You may have, kind of like my grandparents, make the visit, pluck an orange, bring the orange back with them. See, look, I have a Jaffa orange. I've been there. It exists. Back to Yonkers. A underdeveloped city. But here was Nasser and the Arab states saying, we're going to push the Israelis into the sea. The fear of that, whatever sort of balance, whatever might have occurred in 1948, that would collapse. And this feeling that there was going to be a second Holocaust brought to the fore the first. And tied in with remarkable results of the Six-Day War, again, also reinforced that sense of never again is indeed real, a fact. Never again for the Jewish people. Does that mark an ending? That there will not be a second Holocaust. Also, in 1967 was the emergence of the movement about Soviet Jewry. Because had Stalin not died or been murdered, he was prepared to undertake a mass slaughter, genocidal proportions of the Jewish population of the Soviet Union. And throughout, after that period, even though the genocide was not there, the repression of Jewish life, the discrimination against the Jews, especially those who desired emigration, those who even desired to, let's say, have matzah for Pesach, that became very much a part of American consciousness. In other words, that there are Jews who are being persecuted under duress, and we, Jews in the diaspora, are going to take action. So is this recognition, not of Israel taking action to save Israelis, but Jews in the diaspora about to take action for Jews not in the United States but elsewhere, does that mark a transformation and a certain kind of closure? (1978, 1979). Perhaps I should actually go back to 1977 and ABC again. Can't get rid of them. Roots. You have a mini-series about a marginalized, oppressed group. America's own history brought forth with an incredible, popular, to the surprise of many, engagement. 1978, NBC wanted a piece of that action too. And there was another group who had experienced a history of oppression. And the Holocaust miniseries was screened. And it also had a huge audience. And by focusing on families, it allowed moments of identification. Of course, having Meryl Streep as a Gentile woman marrying a Jew doesn't hurt either. And willing to suffer out of love for her love, the Jewish artist. You know, it pushed all kinds of buttons. It grabbed people. So now it's really very much part of, not of popular consciousness. 1979, the miniseries plays in Germany. Before it's shown, all the newspapers, all the intellectuals say, my God, this is just another piece of Hollywood, you know, crap. You know, it's just a soap opera, blah, 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 blah. For those nights that it was shown, the majority of German television viewers watched it. And all of a sudden, you had the second generation and third generation saying, what were you doing, Fatih? What were you doing, Opa? All of a sudden, this Holocaust then created a whole new sense. It's not kind of an official response like reparations or trials, but now it's in the home. Now it becomes personal. And is that a new, again, a different kind of ending where a sort of embodiment of this? 1993. Two key events at that point. Spielberg, Schindler's List, where you have a major film which, until the last half hour, unlike the Holocaust miniseries, is indeed a work of cinema that grabs individuals. Again, you have a nice Gentile, but you have a Gentile that undergoes a transformation. The beginning of Schindler's List, he's a vampire. Remember, you don't see him at all until he finally shows up in the mirror. You know, and so he's this monster who transforms, but it grabs individuals in a different way than Holocaust does. And it becomes a film that's now being shown in schools, church groups. and brings it forth. And also in 1993 is the founding of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. That opens up and becomes, at that point, the #1 tourist attraction in Washington, D.C. And it becomes a necessary stop for foreign leaders, including nationalists from Croatia who were doing homage to the Ustasha, who had spent the 40s murdering Jews and Serbs and Romani. But here is a sense in the center of the United States, a form of commemoration, institutionalization, transforming it in part to an aspect of American identity. Not just Jewish identity, but of American identity. Can we speak there of, again, as a certain kind of ending? And we have now 2017, where we have a presidential proclamation on International Holocaust Remembrance Day where the Jews are not mentioned, where we have, at the very least, ethnic cleansing of Rohingya from Myanmar, where we still have massive atrocities being performed in a number of places on the African continent, where we have the language of hatred, of exclusion in populist parties throughout Europe and North America. Has it ended? Hence the infinity sign. Now, that we're still seeking ends is what's on the other side of this sheet about, because what it is in 2005, the UN tried to make a part of international law, R2P, the right to protect, the responsibility to protect. Part of what it means to be a member of the international community, to be a member of humanity. We all have a responsibility to protect. And so, not so much of an ending, but of an ongoing responsibility of all of us to deal not just with genocide or ethnic cleansing, but all of these other steps that we could call warning signs or preparatory steps. But these kinds of acts against individuals, we too have a responsibility to protect. Or if you have one of those little spelling games, we could always change the C to an S, and we have a responsibility to protest. Okay. When an event ends entails interpretation. Now, numbers, too, are acts of interpretation. And there are lots of numbers that have been associated with the destruction of European Jewry. And the last set of cards, placards, address these numbers. So let me start with 42,500 plus. Those are, at this point, the number of concentration camps, labor camps, ghettos, death camps, transit camps spread throughout occupied Europe. So it wasn't just 6 death camps in Poland or 20 major concentration camps in Poland and Germany, or big ghettos like Warsaw or Łódź, or transit camps like Drancy outside of Paris. 42,500 distinct locations throughout Europe, noticeable places. $250,000 to 1 million. You'll hear such figures from Holocaust skeptics, Holocaust deniers. Yes, Jews died. Civilians die in war. Atrocities happen in war. So yes, Jews died. But a systematic killing and attempted destruction? The 6 million you say died? How many Jews are there in Israel? 6 million? How many Jews are there in the United States? 6 million? Maybe Israel and the US split those 6 million. 3 million made it to Israel, 3 million made it to... So if you want to talk about Jews dying, okay, I'll even give you 1 million. But any larger number, that's either Jewish attempts to finagle money out of Germany, or else it's a Soviet attempt to confuse, to say, we aren't bad, look at the Nazis, look what they did. $1.5 million. Yes?
I'm sorry, I missed what the 250 to 1 million.
These are the various numbers you'll hear from Holocaust deniers.
For the number of deaths?
Jews who died. And it was no systematic, it was no intention, it just happened to be they were civilians, collateral damage, atrocities, hunger, disease. These happened during war. And there are millions of other civilians who also suffered such collateral damage.
There were no gas chambers.
No gas chambers. No Holocaust by bullets. No killing fields. 1.5 million. 1.5 million is the estimate for the number of Jewish children who died. This number is actually brought up by Gideon Hauser in the Eichmann trial. Why would this be a significant number? What?
An entire generation.
That would be one reason, but it's more a matter of that children could not have done anything. In other words, adults may have committed something. There may have been a reason to kill adults, but what possible reason do you have for killing children? What? Sorry?
They're useless.
Well, yeah, there's a reason. But again, that's not a reason that civilized society would accept as a legitimate reason. Yeah. Okay? So this calls attention to that, which then reflects back on the vast number of other Jews. In other words, that they would kill this millions of children reflects on what happened to the non-children, Jewish children who were killed, Jewish non-children who were killed. Okay. $2 million plus. In the first several decades after the last camp was liberated, what was viewed as what had happened to the Jewish people was gassing in the camps. That was what Auschwitz was the image of Holocaust. But before the gas chambers were in action, the Holocaust by bullets began on the Eastern Front. Well over 2 million Jews were shot to death. And there are thousands of killing fields that are to this day still being discovered. So an aspect, this 2 million calls attention to an aspect of the attempted destruction of the European Jewry that had not really been recognized. And last year, Father Dubois, who has been leading these discoveries of these killing fields, came to Nashville and spoke, and has a website which, if you go to it, you will see maps with dots. Lots and lots of dots. Okay. 5,693,851. It's an estimate. Why I say it's an estimate? Because we do not know exactly how many individual Jews died, how many individual dead bodies. So this is one way of calling attention to not the 6 million, which is an icon. It refers to the event. It was a figure that emerged in the Nuremberg trials out of several things. One was supposedly a second or third hand of an estimate that Eichmann made. Another was there are 9 million, actually 9.5 million Jews who were there. 60% of the Jewish population died. That came to roughly 5.9 plus million. Rounded up, 6 million Jews died. But the 6 million is the event. We talk about the 6 million, not about each of the 5,693,851. We talk about the 6 million. And with an estimate down to the ones place doesn't quite convey what one wants from the 6 million. But what we cannot forget is going back down to the ones place. The other 6 million. This was how Poland referred to the unknown Holocaust of the 6 million Poles who were slaughtered by the Nazis. And that was 3 million Poles and 3 million Polish Jews. And so they appropriated the number of 6 million to describe Poland's experience. But again, also notice the distinction, Poles and Polish Jews. And indeed, there were well over 2 million Poles who were murdered by the Germans. Gentile Poles, as well as the over 3 million Jewish Poles. And that gets actually reflected here in this 1.1 million, 1.4 million, 4 million. When Poland was still under communist control, Auschwitz, the memorial at Auschwitz, listed the number of dead, which was an early Soviet estimate, as 4 million. And the 4 million were described as 4 million Poles and other victims of fascism. So the specificity of Jewish victims was screened out, elided. And now our current accounts see perhaps 1.4 million individuals died in Auschwitz and surrounding camps, of which 1.1 million were in Auschwitz for having been identified as Jews. $11 million. For quite a while, there was a concern. You hear about the 6 million, you hear about what the Jews suffered, but so many other civilians were murdered for racial reasons, sexual reasons, because they were prisoners of war. They need to be recognized as well. So Simon Wiesenthal began talking about the 11 million civilians who were murdered by the Nazis. He made up the number on the spot. You have 6 million Jews, 5 million non-Jews. 6 million is still more than 5 million. So you have 11 million. The estimates, again, depending upon how you want to talk about civilians, at least 13 million civilians, for various reasons, were murdered. And by civilians, I'm also including Soviet prisoners of war, because when they are prisoners of war, they are no longer engaged in active fighting. They are supposedly under the protection of the Geneva Convention, of which starving to death was not one of the protocols. $8,000 a day. On the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, when over 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered by the ruling Hutus, their militias, and their neighbors. There was a concern. How do you communicate to the world what they had experienced? How can 800,000 compare to 6 million? Well, more than 800,000 people were murdered during the course of 100 days. 8,000 Rwandans a day were murdered. So to get one to recognize, whereas 800,000 may not strike you the same way, the notion of 8,000 a day was a way of saying, listen, people were murdered. And I come to my last number. 1. Every individual who was alive or was living at some point between, let's say, 1933 and 1945, whether they are now viewed as a survivor or as a murdered victim or as a perpetrator or a bystander or a collaborator or a rescuer or a resistor, each and every one of them had their own Holocaust. Each had their own experience of that period. That's the one. The other one. All of those who died also lived. And that's also something we should never forget. They had lives, not just deaths. And that's what we should also remember, that they had lives. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm here, I'm available, and I very much appreciate your patience and your listening.
Thank you to everyone for being here for the series, to our pastors, to our friends in the churches and synagogue, and we thank you again today, and we hope we do more wonderful events like this together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll answer your question.